She didn't belong on the mountain. Her dress was torn, hem-heavy with frozen mud, and her breathing sounded like cracked glass. When she collapsed against his doorframe, the wind howling at her back, she didn't ask for food or medicine or a warm fire. She grabbed the collar of his heavy wool coat, looked into his cold, skeptical eyes, and rasped, "Please. Pretend you're my husband." The mountain man stared down at her bruised face. He said just one word. The cold up here didn't bite. It soared. It took a dull, rusty edge to your bones and just kept working away until you stopped feeling your fingers. Caleb brought the axe down. The pine log split with a sharp, satisfying crack, the two halves tumbling into the snow. He didn't pause. He reached for another, set it on the block, and swung again. The rhythm was all he had. Chop, breathe, reset. The sky above the jagged tree line of the Rockies was the color of a bruised iron skillet, heavy and low. Winter was coming early. By nightfall, the pass would be buried under 3 feet of powder, effectively cutting his cabin off from the mining town of Red Dog, 20 miles below. That was exactly how he wanted it. He drove the axe into the chopping block and left it there. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of a leather-gloved hand. His breath plumed in the freezing air, thick and white. He smelled pine sap, impending snow, and the stale grease on his own coat. It was a good, quiet life. Solitary. Uncomplicated by the greed and noise of other people. Then the dog barked. Caleb turned. His hound, a battered mix of wolf and something vaguely hound-like named Rust, stood at the edge of the clearing, hackles raised. Rust didn't bark at deer. He didn't bark at bears, he growled. This was a warning bark. Caleb walked to the woodpile, sliding his heavy Sharps rifle from the leather scabbard he kept leaning against the logs. He cocked the hammer. The metallic click was loud in the deadened, snowy air. A horse stumbled through the tree line. It was a roan gelding, heavily lathered, despite the freezing temperature, its chest-heaving legs trembling. But Caleb wasn't looking at the horse. He was looking at the rider. She was slumped over the saddle horn. Her fingers were tangled in the mane, white-knuckled and bare. No gloves, no coat. Just a heavy dark blue wool dress that was plastered to her skin, stiff with frozen sleet and mud. Her hair a tangled mess of dark brown, whipped violently across her face. The horse took 2 more steps into the clearing and simply gave out, dropping to its knees with a heavy grunt. The woman rolled off the saddle. She hit the snow hard and didn't move. Caleb didn't run. Out here, rushing got you killed. He scanned the tree line behind her. No movement. No sounds of a posse. Just the wind whining through the pines. He kept the rifle raised, taking slow, deliberate steps until he stood over her. She looked dead. Her lips were a pale, unnatural blue, and her skin was the color of old parchment. But then her chest hitched. A ragged, wet cough tore out of her throat. Caleb sighed. A deep, heavy exhale of pure annoyance. He didn't want this. He had come up the mountain to escape the mess of humanity, not to drag it out of the snow. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and crouched, grabbing her roughly by the shoulder to turn her over. "Hey!" Her eyes fluttered open. They were a startling pale grey, but bloodshot and wide with absolute panic. She didn't scream. Instead, her hand shot out with surprising speed, her frozen claw-like fingers gripping the lapel of his heavy canvas coat. She pulled herself up her face, inches from his. He could smell the desperation on her. Sweat, old blood, and fear. "They're coming!" she rasped. Her voice was shredded. "Nobody's coming up this pass today," Caleb said, his voice flat, devoid of pity. "You're freezing to death." She didn't seem to hear him. Her grip tightened, her knuckles shaking. "You have to tell them. You have to claim me. I don't have to do a darn thing. Let go of my coat." She pulled harder, her grey eyes locking onto his with a terrifying, manic clarity. "Please!" She begged the word, cracking in the frigid air. Please pretend you're my husband." Caleb looked at her. He looked at the dying horse. He looked at the darkening sky. He didn't feel a surge of heroic duty. He felt the cold reality of a massive, dangerous inconvenience. He looked back down into her desperate eyes. "No!" Her eyes rolled back, and the tension left her body. She collapsed a dead weight in the snow, her grip sliding off his coat. Caleb stood there for a long moment. The first flakes of the blizzard began to fall, fat and heavy, landing on her pale face. He looked at the cabin. The chimney was smoking. It was warm inside. There was coffee on the stove. He could walk away. He had walked away from worse. "Damn it!" he muttered. He bent down, hooked his arms under her armpits, and dragged her toward the cabin. The inside of the cabin smelled heavily of wood smoke, oiled leather, and the lingering scent of last night's venison stew. It was a cramped space, entirely utilitarian. A cast-iron stove dominated the center, radiating a fierce heat. Caleb dumped her onto the narrow rope bed in the corner. She didn't stir. He didn't bother with gentleness. If she stayed in those wet clothes, she'd be dead from pneumonia before morning husband or no husband. He pulled his hunting knife from his belt and sliced through the laces of her ruined leather boots, pulling them off. Her toes were white, cold as marble, but not yet black. He moved to her dress. The buttons down the back were frozen solid. He didn't have time to unfasten them. He took the blade, slipped it under the collar, and pulled down. The heavy, wet wool parted. He peeled the dress off her, leaving her in a thin, soaked cotton chemise. She was shivering violently now, a good sign. It meant her body was still trying to fight. He noticed the bruises then. Dark, angry, purple marks around her ribs and a faded yellow-green splotch on her left hip. Someone had beaten her. Recently. And efficiently. Caleb's expression didn't change. He'd seen battered men and women before. The world was a meat grinder. He grabbed a heavy woolen blanket from the chest at the foot of the bed and threw it over her, tucking it tightly around her shivering frame. He moved back to the stove, poured a tin cup of black, sludgy coffee, and sat heavily in the wooden chair beside the bed. He drank it in silence, watching her. Hours passed. The wind outside turned into a steady, violent roar, throwing sheets of ice against the single-glass window. The blizzard had hit. Nobody was coming up the mountain now. Whoever she was running from was either freezing to death on the trail or huddled in a saloon in Red Dog. Around midnight, her shivering stopped. Caleb stood expecting to find her dead. Instead, he found her staring at him. Her grey eyes were clearer now, taking in the raw timber ceiling, the drying meat hanging from the rafters, and finally settling on him. "You didn't let me die," she said. Her voice was still a rasp, but steadier. "Snow was going to bury you right in my front yard. I hate digging in winter," Caleb said. He didn't smile. He set the empty tin cup down. "Who are you running from?" She pulled the blanket tighter around her neck, realizing she was stripped down to her undergarments. She didn't blush. She didn't act coy. She looked at him with the hardened gaze of someone who had long ago traded modesty for survival. "My name is Abigail," she said. "Didn't ask your name. Asked who you're running from." "A man named Cole Wyatt," Caleb stilled. The name carried weight even up here. Wyatt wasn't a lawman, and he wasn't exactly an outlaw. He was a cattle baron who owned half the valley below and had enough money to buy the other half, including the sheriffs, the judges, and the land office. "Wyatt's not a man you run from, Abigail. He's a man you surrender to or shoot," Caleb said, leaning against the wooden support beam. "I tried the first. It didn't take," she said, her voice dropping. "He decided he wanted my family's land. The valley deed was in my father's name. When my father died, the deed passed to me. Wyatt came calling, offered to buy it. I said no. Then he stopped offering." She touched her ribs beneath the blanket, a phantom flinch. "So he beat you." Caleb stated, no emotion in his voice. "Just facts." "His men did." "Wyatt doesn't get his hands dirty," Abigail said bitterly. "They locked me in the cellar of his estate. Said they'd keep me there until I signed the deed over. Said if I didn't, they'd forge a marriage certificate, kill me, and take it anyway as my grieving husband. And you escaped. I broke a jar of preserves over the guard's head, stole a horse, and rode up the worst trail I could find," she said. She looked at the fire. "Wyatt has the law in his pocket. If a sheriff finds me, they'll drag me back to him. The only way the law leaves a woman alone in this territory is if she belongs to another man. A man who isn't afraid of Cole Wyatt." She looked back up at Caleb. The firelight caught the sharp angles of her jaw. "That's why I asked you to lie," she said quietly. "A husband has legal right to protect his property. In the eyes of the territory, I am property. If I am yours, Wyatt can't just take me without starting a war." Caleb laughed. It was a short, harsh sound, entirely devoid of humor. "Lady, I live in a 10-by-10 box in the snow because I don't want a war. I don't want a wife. And I sure as hell don't want to cross Cole Wyatt." "You already did," Abigail pointed out, her voice hardening. "You took me in. I'm kicking you out the minute the pass thaws. By then they'll be here." She sat up slightly, wincing as her bruised ribs pulled. "They track like hounds, Caleb." She saw his eyes narrow. "Your name is burned into the wood above the door. Caleb, I'm not asking for romance. I'm not asking for a bedmate. I'm asking for a legal shield, a piece of paper and a lie. In exchange..." She hesitated, calculating her meager assets. "When I sell the land to someone back east, I'll give you half." Caleb pushed off the beam and walked to the stove. He threw another log inside. The sparks flew up in a chaotic orange swarm. "Money doesn't mean much up here," he said, shutting the iron door with a clang. "What does?" she asked. He looked at her over his shoulder. "Quiet, peace, being left the hell alone. Then you better hope I die of a fever," Abigail said, lying back down and staring at the ceiling. "Because Cole Wyatt is going to bring a lot of noise to your front door." The storm raged for 3 days. 3 days of suffocating proximity. Abigail recovered faster than Caleb expected. She didn't complain. When she could walk, she wrapped herself in one of his spare canvas coats, rolling the sleeves up a dozen times, and started making herself useful. She ground coffee. She kept the fire stoked. She cleaned the rifle he left on the table. She didn't talk much, and neither did he. It was a tense, wary dance around the small cabin. Caleb watched her. She was efficient. Her movements were sharp, driven by a nervous energy that told him she was constantly listening for the sound of hoofbeats over the howling wind. On the 4th morning, the wind stopped. The silence was deafening. The sun broke through the clouds, glaring blindingly off the fresh, untouched powder that buried the world. Caleb was at the stove, frying fatback in a cast-iron pan. The grease spat and hissed. Abigail was sitting on the edge of the bed, tying the laces of the boots Caleb had repaired for her. Then Rust growled. It wasn't a bark. It was a low, guttural vibration that seemed to shake the floorboards. The dog was staring hard at the heavy oak door. Caleb set the spatula down. The grease kept spitting. He didn't look at Abigail. He walked smoothly to the table and picked up the Sharps rifle. He checked the breech. Loaded. He pulled a heavy Colt revolver from the holster hanging on the wall and tucked it into the waistband of his trousers. Abigail stood up. Her face had gone paper white again, but her jaw was set. She moved to the corner, putting her back to the wall, out of the direct line of sight from the window. She picked up the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. "Stay there," Caleb said quietly. He didn't wait for a knock. He unlatched the door and pulled it open, stepping out onto the small covered porch. The snow was nearly up to the porch boards. Trudging through the drifts were 3 men leading their exhausted horses. They looked half frozen, their coats caked in ice, their breath hanging in the still freezing air. The man in the front was big, broad-shouldered, with a thick black beard and a tin star pinned to his heavy buffalo coat. Caleb recognized him. Sheriff Miller from Red Dog. A man who wore the badge, but collected his pay from Cole Wyatt's payroll. "Morning, Caleb." Miller called out his voice, hoarse from the cold. He stopped a few yards from the porch, his hand resting casually near the butt of the revolver on his hip. The 2 men behind him fanned out slightly, their hands deep in their pockets, but their postures stiff. "Miller Wafkor," Caleb said, leaning against the doorframe, keeping the rifle pointed casually at the floorboards. "Long ride for a social call. Wasn't a ride. Was a damn march." Miller spat, kicking at a snowdrift. "Pass is miserable. Look, I ain't out here to freeze my ass off making small talk. I'm looking for a runaway." "Runaway what?" Caleb asked, his face a mask of bored indifference. "A woman. Dark hair. Stole a horse from Mr. Wyatt's property down in the valley. We tracked the animal's prints up this way before the storm buried 'em." Miller squinted at the cabin. "You seen anyone come up this way?" "Storm's been blowing for 3 days, Miller. Anything that came up this mountain is buried under 6 feet of snow," Caleb said. Miller took a step closer, stepping onto the first rung of the porch stairs. The wood creaked loudly. "Maybe. But your chimney's smoking. And I know you don't mind the company of a stray now and then." Miller's eyes tried to pierce the gloom inside the cabin behind Caleb. "Nobody here but me and the dog," Caleb said, shifting his weight. The movement was slight, but it brought the barrel of the sharps up just an inch. A clear warning, Miller noticed. He stopped, but he didn't back down. Wyatt was paying him too much to go back empty-handed. "I got to be sure, Caleb. It's the law. I'm going to have to take a look inside." "You don't have a warrant, Miller." "Out here, I am the warrant." Miller took another step up. The 2 men behind him pulled their hands from their pockets. One held a shotgun, the other a repeater. Caleb felt a cold, familiar anger rise in his chest. He hated these men. He hated the arrogance of them thinking they could push into his quiet world and take whatever they wanted. He thought of the woman standing in the corner behind him, gripping a fireplace poker with white-knuckled desperation. He thought of the bruises on her ribs. He didn't care about Cole Wyatt's land. He didn't care about Abigail's money. But he cared about his door, and he cared about who got to walk through it. Miller reached for the door handle. Caleb brought the rifle up. The heavy barrel leveled directly at the center of Miller's chest. The metallic clack of the hammer being pulled back echoed sharply off the snowy pines. Miller froze. The deputies behind him raised their weapons. The silence returned heavy and lethal. "You step into my home, Miller, and I'll blow a hole in you so big the wind will whistle through it," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "You're protecting her." Miller said, his eyes narrowing, a nervous sweat breaking out on his forehead, despite the cold. "You're harboring stolen property, Caleb. That's a hanging offense." "She ain't property," Caleb said. "Wyatt says different. She's his ward until she signs that deed." Caleb stared at the sheriff. He calculated the odds. He could shoot Miller, drop one of the deputies, but the 3rd would likely get a shot off. Even if he survived, he'd be an outlaw. His quiet life on the mountain would be over. The cynical, pragmatic part of his brain screamed at him to step aside, to let them take her. She wasn't his problem. He felt a presence behind him. Abigail had moved from the corner. She stood just inside the doorway, visible in the shadows, still wearing his oversized coat. Miller smiled a cruel, triumphant curl of his lips. "There she is. Step aside, Caleb. The lady is coming with us." Caleb didn't lower the rifle. He looked at Miller, then at the 2 deputies taking in the cheap suits under their coats, the hired gun swagger. Then he spoke. The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but he said them with a cold, absolute conviction that brokered no argument. "She isn't Wyatt's ward," Caleb said, his voice ringing out across the clearing. "And she isn't a runaway." Miller frowned. "Then what the hell is she?" Caleb didn't look back at Abigail, but he could feel the sudden, breathless tension radiating from her. "She's my wife." Caleb lied, the word heavy and final in the winter air. Miller barked a laugh, though it sounded nervous. "Bullshit! You don't have a wife." "We were married in Denver 3 weeks ago, before the snows hit." Caleb said, his face an impenetrable wall. "She came up ahead of me, got lost on the trail. I found her." "I don't believe you," Miller sneered. "Show me a paper." "Paper burnt in a campfire accident," Caleb countered smoothly, stepping slightly to block more of Abigail from view. "But territorial law says a man's word claiming a wife holds until a circuit judge says otherwise." "You ain't a judge, Miller." Miller hesitated. Territorial law was a murky swamp of half-remembered rules and frontier improvisations, but Caleb was right about one thing. A husband's claim superseded a local sheriff's warrant for a ward, at least until a courtroom got involved. Shooting a lone mountain man was one thing. Shooting a homesteader defending his legal wife was a fast way to get the federal marshals sniffing around Wyatt's business. Wyatt wouldn't like that. "Wyatt ain't going to accept this." Miller warned, his hand still hovering near his gun. "Wyatt can take it up with the federal courts in the spring," Caleb said, the rifle still pointed squarely at the sheriff's heart. "Until then, my wife stays on my property. Now get off my porch before I decide I don't like your face." Miller stared at the black hole of the rifle barrel. He looked at Caleb's dead, unblinking eyes. He knew a killer when he saw one. Slowly, Miller raised his hands, backing down the wooden steps. "All right, Caleb. All right. But the snow's going to melt eventually. And when it does, you better hope you got a better story than a burnt piece of paper." He turned to his men. "Mount up. We're heading back." Caleb watched them trudge back through the deep snow, mount their shivering horses, and disappear down the treacherous trail. He didn't lower the rifle until the last sound of them faded into the wind. He uncocked the hammer and turned around. Abigail was standing there staring at him. Her grey eyes were wide, a complex mix of relief shock and something else he couldn't quite read. "You claimed me," she whispered. Caleb walked past her, setting the rifle heavily on the table. He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling a sudden, intense exhaustion. "I didn't claim you," Caleb said, his voice returning to its cynical, gruff baseline. "I just bought us until the spring thaw. After that, you're on your own." He walked back to the stove and picked up the spatula. The grease had burned, smoking black against the iron. He scraped it off. "Husband," she said softly behind him, testing the word on her tongue. "Don't call me that," he snapped, not turning around. "It's a lie. It's a shield. Nothing more." "A shield," she repeated. He heard the rustle of the canvas coat as she moved closer. "Then I suppose I should say thank you for the shield." Caleb didn't answer. He stared at the ruined fatback. The quiet of his mountain was gone. The isolation he had fought so hard to build was shattered. He had a fake wife, a corrupt sheriff, and a wealthy, ruthless cattle baron breathing down his neck. He closed his eyes and let out a long, slow breath. It was going to be a long winter. The romantic notion of a winter snow-in was a lie invented by people who had never actually survived one. In reality, being snowbound was a grinding, suffocating endurance test. The cabin, which had felt comfortably solitary to Caleb just a week ago, shrank with every passing day. The walls seemed to press inward, the heavy timber groaning under the increasing weight of the snowpack on the roof. The air inside grew thick and stale, a permanent soup of wood smoke, boiling beans, and the scent of 2 unwashed human bodies trapped in a 10 by 10 wooden box. They established boundaries without speaking them. The corner with the rope bed belonged to Abigail. The rocking chair by the stove and the floor beside it belonged to Caleb. Rust the dog mediated the space between deciding day by day whose feet he preferred to lie across. Caleb spent his days fixing things that didn't need fixing. He oiled his traps. He sharpened his axes until they could shave the hair off his forearm. He cleaned the Sharps rifle, the Colt revolver, and an old double-barrel shotgun so many times the bluing on the steel began to wear. He didn't want to look at her. Looking at her meant acknowledging she was there, and acknowledging she was there meant accepting the massive target she had painted on his back. But he couldn't help it. The space was simply too small. He watched her from the corner of his eye as he whittled a new handle for a skinning knife. Abigail wasn't a porcelain doll. He had expected her to break down, to cry over the harsh conditions, the lack of a proper bath, the monotonous diet of hardtack, dried venison, and beans. She didn't. Instead, she watched him. She learned his routines. When he reached for the coffee pot in the morning, it was already hot. When he brought in a fresh load of firewood, stomping the snow off his boots, she had a dry rag waiting for him. She didn't do it with a servant's deference. She did it with a grim, calculated efficiency. She was paying her rent. "You don't have to scrape the grease trap," Caleb said one afternoon. The wind outside was a dull, rhythmic thud against the logs like a giant fist pounding on the door. Abigail didn't stop scraping the iron skillet with a piece of slate. "If I don't, the cabin smells like rancid fat. And if I just sit here staring at the wall, I'll lose my mind. Suit yourself." Caleb picked up his sewing awl and a piece of stiff leather, intending to patch his winter boots. He jammed the needle through. The heavy waxed thread bound up. He gave it a sharp yank. The needle snapped the broken half, gouging deep into his thumb. He cursed a short, sharp bark of pain and dropped the leather. Blood welled up instantly, thick and dark, dripping onto the floorboards. Abigail dropped the skillet. She crossed the small room in 2 strides, grabbing a clean rag from the line above the stove. "Let me see," she said. "I've got it," Caleb grunted, trying to pull his hand away. She didn't let go. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Her hands were no longer the soft, pale things that had gripped his coat out in the snow. They were chapped raw from the cold water and the lye soap the nails filed down to the quick. "Stop being stubborn," she said, her voice entirely flat. "If that gets infected, I don't know how to chop the wood. And I don't want to freeze to death because you pridefully bled out over a boot patch." She pressed the rag against his thumb, applying hard, steady pressure. Caleb stopped pulling away. He sat frozen in the rocking chair. She was standing between his knees. It was the closest they had been since the day he dragged her out of the blizzard. He could feel the heat radiating off her. He smelled the lye soap on her skin beneath it, the faint, warm scent of something distinctly female. It made his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with anger. Abigail kept her eyes focused on his hand. "Hold this," she ordered, pressing his good hand over the rag. She turned, fetched a bottle of clear, foul-smelling corn whiskey from the shelf, and brought it back. "This is going to burn. I know how whiskey works," he muttered. She pulled the rag away and poured the liquor directly over the deep gouge. Caleb didn't flinch. His jaw locked a muscle ticking in his cheek, but he made no sound. Abigail watched his face. She took the clean corner of the rag and bound the thumb, tightly tying a neat, efficient knot. "Where did you learn to do that?" Caleb asked, his voice lower than usual. "My father," she said, stepping back, putting the necessary distance between them again. The sudden absence of her body heat left Caleb feeling strangely cold. He was a rancher before he was a land baron. Men got hurt. I patched them up. She walked back to the stove and picked up the skillet. "You're a long way from a ranch, Abigail," Caleb said. "So are you, Caleb," she replied, not looking back. "Nobody builds a cabin at 10,000 feet unless they're running from something worse than a cattle baron. Caleb looked down at his neatly bandaged hand. The cynical retort he usually kept loaded died in his throat. He picked up his boots and went back to work, the silence in the cabin suddenly feeling less like a cage and more like a shared trench. February brought a cold that didn't just freeze the water in the bucket, it seemed to freeze the time itself. The days blurred into a grey, indistinguishable loop. Wake stoke the fire, melt snow for water, eat, wait for the sun to go down. Sleep. For Abigail, the nights were worse than the days. During the day, she could keep her hands busy. She could focus on the physical ache in her muscles to drown out the memory of the cellar. But at night, when the fire died down to a dull red glow, and the wind whistled through the chinking in the logs, the darkness brought Cole Wyatt's men back. Caleb woke to the sound of a muffled, frantic scratching. He didn't move. He lay in his bedroll on the floor, his hand instantly finding the smooth wooden grip of the Colt beneath his makeshift pillow. He listened. It wasn't a bear at the door. The sound was coming from inside the cabin. He turned his head. In the dim, dying light of the stove embers, he saw Abigail. She was asleep, but her body was thrashing against the ropes of the bed. Her hands were clawing desperately at the heavy woolen blanket, her fingers hooked into talons tearing at the fabric. She was whimpering a high, thin sound of absolute terror that made the hair on the back of Caleb's neck stand up. "No," she gasped, her voice choked and small. "Don't! The paper! I won't sign! Don't!" Caleb sat up. He had spent years trying to avoid other people's pain. He didn't want the responsibility of it. But watching her tear her own fingernails bloody against the wool, he found he couldn't just lie there. He threw off his blankets and crossed the floor in his bare feet. "Abigail," he said, quietly standing over the bed. She didn't hear him. Her head whipped side to side. "Please!" He reached down and grabbed her wrists. The moment his hands touched her, she exploded. Her eyes flew open, blind and unseeing in the dark, filled with a primal panic. She didn't recognize him. She saw a man's silhouette in the dark, holding her down, and she fought with everything she had. She threw a desperate, wild punch that caught Caleb square in the jaw. His head snapped back. He tasted copper. "Damn it, woman!" he growled, shaking off the hit. She kicked out, tangling her legs in the blanket, still fighting, trying to scramble backward against the wall. "Abigail!" Caleb barked, not yelling, but using a sharp, commanding tone that cut through the panic. He pinned her wrists to the mattress, leaning his weight over her, careful not to crush her ribs. "Stop, look at me, look at my face." She heaved her breath, coming in ragged, tearing sobs. She fought his grip for another 5 seconds, before her eyes finally focused. She saw the raw timber ceiling. She saw the dying embers. She saw the battered, bearded face of the mountain man leaning over her. The fight drained out of her instantly. She went limp against the mattress. Caleb released her wrists and stepped back, wiping a thumb across his bleeding lip. Abigail pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. She buried her face in her knees. She didn't sob aloud, but her shoulders shook violently. Caleb stood there awkwardly. He looked at the stove. He looked at his bedroll. He sighed. He walked over to the stove, opened the iron door, and threw in a handful of kindling and a small log. The fire flared up, casting dancing orange light across the small room. He filled the tin pot with melted snow and set it on the hottest part of the iron. He didn't say anything until the water was boiling. He poured it into a tin cup tossed in a pinch of dried mint leaves he'd harvested in the autumn, and walked back to the bed. He held the cup out. Abigail looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale and exhausted. She took the cup her hands, shaking so badly the hot water sloshed over the rim onto her knuckles. She didn't seem to notice the burn. Caleb didn't go back to his bedroll. He dragged the wooden chair over and sat backward on it, crossing his arms over the backrest. "They kept me in the dark," she said. Her voice was a hollow whisper. "For 5 days. No light. Just the sound of the rats. And then the door would open, and his men would come down." She stared into the tin cup, as if it held the answers to the universe. "Every time I close my eyes, I hear the hinges squeak." Caleb watched her. The cynical armor he wore, like a second skin, felt incredibly heavy right now. "I was at Antietam," Caleb said. Abigail looked up surprised. It was the first time he had offered a single detail about his past. "Cornfield." Caleb continued, his voice flat, staring past her at the rough-hewn logs. Bullets cutting the stalks down like a scythe. Men screaming. For 3 years after the war, every time the wind blew through a wheat field, I'd dive into the dirt looking for my rifle. I broke a man's nose in a saloon in Denver because he dropped a beer glass, and it sounded like a percussion cap. He looked back at her. His eyes were hard, not with anger, but with the weary resilience of a survivor. "The hinges are going to squeak for a long time, Abigail," he said brutally. "You can't stop the noise. You just have to learn that it's only a ghost. And ghosts can't hold a pen to make you sign a deed." Abigail took a slow sip of the hot mint tea. The shivering began to subside. She looked at this rough, violent man who lived in the snow and realized for the first time that he wasn't running from the world because he hated it. He was running from it because he had seen too much of it. "Did the wheat fields ever stop sounding like gunfire?" she asked softly. "No," Caleb said, standing up and pushing the chair back. "I just stopped planting wheat." He walked back to his bedroll and lay down. "Go to sleep, Abigail. I'll listen for the door." She didn't sleep immediately. But for the rest of the night, as she lay staring at the wooden ceiling, the sound of the wind didn't sound like men in the cellar. It just sounded like the wind. And the steady rhythmic breathing of the man on the floor was a tether that kept her grounded in the present. March broke the silence. It didn't come with green grass and bird song. It came with a slight shift in the air pressure and the terrifying, thunderous sound of a distant avalanche deep in the range. The temperature rose just enough during the day for the top layer of snow to melt, then froze violently at night, creating a brutal crust of ice over the 5-foot drifts. Travel was no longer impossible. It was just treacherous. Caleb knew what that meant. He didn't say it to Abigail, but his routine shifted. He kept the Sharps rifle fully loaded and leaning by the door. He didn't let Rust wander past the tree line. When he went to chop wood, he spent more time scanning the valley pass than swinging the axe. Wyatt wasn't a man who waited for a spring thaw if he didn't have to. It happened on a Tuesday. The sky was a blinding, painfully clear blue. Caleb was outside using an iron pry bar to break the ice off the hinges of the woodshed. Abigail was inside boiling old coffee grounds for the 3rd time. Rust was sitting on the porch. He didn't growl. He simply stood up the fur along his spine, bristling into a stiff ridge, and let out a low, barely audible whine. Caleb stopped hammering the ice. He didn't turn around immediately. He let the pry bar slide down into his gloved hand, gripping it like a club. He looked at the dog. Rust was staring directly at a dense cluster of blue spruce about 60 yards out near the edge of the drop-off. Someone was out there. And they were good. They had managed to get within 60 yards of the cabin without breaking through the ice crust loud enough for Caleb to hear. Caleb didn't yell for Abigail. Yelling gave away his position and told the shooter he was panicked. He dropped the pry bar. In one fluid motion, he drew the heavy Colt from his hip, spun, and dove behind the thick oak chopping block, just as a puff of white smoke bloomed from the spruces. The crack of a high-powered rifle shattered the quiet of the mountain. A split second later, the heavy slug slammed into the chopping block, sending a spray of sharp wood splinters into Caleb's face. Inside the cabin, the sound of breaking pottery echoed. Abigail had dropped the coffee pot. "Stay down," Caleb roared, knowing she could hear him through the thin walls. Another shot rang out. This one hit the dirt right where Caleb's leg had been a second before, kicking up a shower of frozen mud. The shooter wasn't moving. He was entrenched, waiting for Caleb to break cover. Caleb gritted his teeth. He had the Colt, but a handgun was useless at 60 yards against a man with a rifle. His Sharps was just inside the cabin door, 10 feet away, 10 feet of open, completely exposed porch. "Abigail," Caleb yelled, keeping his head down as a third shot clipped the top of the chopping block. "The rifle, throw it out the door." Silence. "Abigail, throw the damn rifle." The heavy oak door cracked open. Not wide. Just a sliver. Caleb expected to see the barrel of the Sharps shoved out into the snow. Instead, he saw Abigail. She threw the door open wide, stepping fully onto the porch. She wasn't holding the rifle. She was holding the heavy double-barreled shotgun Caleb kept by the bed. It was too big for her, the stock tucked awkwardly under her arm. "No!" Caleb screamed. The shooter in the trees shifted his aim. A woman was a much easier target than a man behind a stump. Abigail didn't hesitate. She didn't aim with any practiced skill. She leveled the shotgun generally at the blue spruces and pulled both triggers at the exact same time. The recoil was massive. The blast blew her backward off her feet, throwing her hard against the cabin wall. But a double blast of buckshot at 60 yards spread wide. It tore through the branches of the spruce, shredding pine needles and bark in a violent hail of lead. It didn't kill the shooter, but it scared the hell out of him. The man let out a shout of surprise, breaking his cover, standing up to retreat deeper into the woods. That was all Caleb needed. He didn't scramble for the cabin. He stood up from behind the chopping block, raised the Colt, took a breath to steady his racing heart, and fired twice. The heavy .44 caliber slugs crossed the distance. The first missed, burying itself in a tree trunk. The second caught the man squarely in the shoulder. The shooter spun like a top, dropping his rifle in the snow, and pitched backward over the steep edge of the drop-off. There was a sound of breaking branches, a dull thud, and then silence. Caleb didn't lower the gun. He kept it trained on the tree line for a full minute. Nothing moved. He turned around. Abigail was sitting on the porch boards, gasping for air, clutching her right shoulder. The shotgun lay in the snow a few feet away. Caleb holstered his gun and vaulted up the steps. He dropped to his knees beside her, grabbing her chin, tilting her face up. She was pale, shocked, but her grey eyes were wide and frantic. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his hands quickly checking her arms, her chest looking for blood. "Did he hit you?" "No," she gasped, wincing in pain. The gun kicked." Caleb let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for a year. He looked at the shotgun, then back at her. The cynical wall he had built between them cracked wide open. "You stupid, reckless woman," he said, his voice shaking with a rage born entirely of fear. "You don't walk out into a rifle line. You throw the gun out. Why didn't you throw the rifle? Because you were pinned down." Abigail snapped back, her voice equally fierce, though she was still trembling. "If I threw the rifle, he would have shot you while you went for it. The shotgun was loaded. It made noise. It nearly broke your collarbone, and it nearly got you killed. I am not going to sit inside a box and listen to men die for me anymore. Caleb," she yelled, shoving his hands away, though the movement made her cry out in pain. "I'm not doing it." Caleb stared at her. Her chest was heaving. Her hair had come undone, falling wildly around her face. She looked fierce, terrified, and incredibly alive. He realized then that the game had changed. The lie they told Sheriff Miller was no longer just a legal shield. When he saw her step out onto that porch, taking fire to protect him, a cold, terrifying truth had settled into his bones. He wasn't pretending anymore. He didn't yell back. He reached down, slipped his arms under her back and beneath her knees, and lifted her off the cold porch boards. She gasped at the sudden movement, instinctively wrapping her good arm around his neck, burying her face in the collar of his coat. "I've got you," Caleb murmured, the roughness gone from his voice, replaced by a quiet, dangerous vow. He carried her into the cabin and kicked the door shut against the mountain. They had drawn first blood. The winter was over. The war had just begun. The bruise on her shoulder was the color of a bruised plum, spreading angrily across her pale skin. Caleb knelt beside the bed. He held a rag soaked in hot water and witch hazel. He didn't ask for permission this time. He gently unbuttoned the collar of the oversized shirt she wore, pushing the fabric back just enough to expose the damage the heavy shotgun stock had done. Abigail hissed through her teeth as the hot rag made contact. "Hold still," Caleb murmured. His hands, massive and scarred from years of axe work and frostbite, moved with startling precision. He didn't linger, but he didn't rush either. The silence between them was different now. The tension of two strangers trapped in a box was gone, replaced by the heavy pulling gravity of two people who had just crossed a point of no return. She had pulled a trigger for him. He had carried her. The territory between a fake marriage and a real one had vanished somewhere in the 60 yards between the porch and the blue spruces. "That man," Abigail said, her voice raspy. She was staring at the wall, not looking at his hands. "Did you kill him?" He fell 60 feet into a ravine with a .44 slug in his shoulder. Caleb said flatly, dipping the rag back into the hot water. "If the bullet didn't kill him, the drop did. If the drop didn't, the cold will." He wrung the water out. But he wasn't alone. Men like that always have a spotter down the trail. By nightfall, Cole Wyatt is going to know I didn't hand you over, and he's going to know we shoot back. Abigail finally looked at him. "So they'll bring more. They'll bring an army." Caleb pulled the rag away and carefully pulled her collar back up, fastening the top button. His knuckles brushed the skin of her throat. For a second, neither of them moved. He met her grey eyes. There was no fear in them anymore. Just a hard, crystallized resolve. Caleb stood up and turned to his gun belt hanging on the wall. He began sliding fresh cartridges into the leather loops. "We can't stay here," he said, his back to her. "The cabin is a blind corner. They'll just surround it and burn us out. We have to leave." Abigail didn't argue. She swung her legs over the side of the bed. "When?" "Now, before the sun sets and the ice crust freezes solid again." They packed in brutal efficiency. Survival on the mountain meant leaving sentiment behind. Caleb took the guns, the ammunition, 3 days of dried meat, and a heavy canvas tarp. Abigail bundled in the warmest layers she could find. She took the shotgun. Caleb didn't try to take it from her. They stepped out onto the porch. The dead man's blood was a bright, shocking, crimson spray across the pristine white snow, leading off the edge of the ravine. Rust sniffed at it, then let out a low growl toward the valley. Caleb led the horses out of the shed. They were restless, sensing the shift in routine, smelling the cordite and blood on the wind. He offered Abigail a hand up into the saddle. She took it. Her grip was strong. "We're going down the pass," Caleb said, looking up at her, his hand still resting on the saddle horn. "It's steep, it's icy. We ride until we hit the choke point at Dead Man's Cut. That's where they'll come through. We don't wait for them to find us. We find them." "And if Wyatt is with them?" she asked. Caleb's jaw set. The cynical mountain man who just wanted to be left alone was entirely gone. In his place was a soldier. "Then I make you a widow," he said. He spurred his horse forward into the deep snow. Abigail pulled the reins following his path, leaving the only safe harbor she had known for months behind them. Dead Man's Cut was a geological mistake. It was a narrow, jagged fissure in the granite, barely wide enough for 2 horses to ride abreast, walled in by sheer cliffs that rose 200 feet on either side. In the summer, it was a dangerous rock slide. In the winter, It was a wind tunnel lined with black ice. Caleb positioned them on a high ledge overlooking the southern entrance of the cut. It required a brutal freezing hour of climbing over treacherous boulders, dragging the horses up an old goat trail, but it gave them the high ground. They laid the canvas tarp out on the freezing rock. Caleb stretched out on his stomach, the heavy barrel of the Sharps rifle resting on a rolled-up blanket. Abigail lay beside him, the shotgun tucked tight against her good shoulder. They waited. The cold here was worse than at the cabin. There was no stove. There was no movement to keep the blood flowing. The chill seeped through the canvas, through their wool coats, directly into their marrow. Caleb. Abigail whispered, her breath barely visible in the fading light. "Keep your eyes on the trail," he murmured, not looking away from the sights of his rifle. "If this goes wrong," she continued, her voice steady, stripping away the last pretenses between them. "If I don't make it down this mountain, you're making it down. Listen to me," she insisted. She reached out her gloved hand, resting over his on the stock of the rifle. "My father's deed. It's sewn into the lining of my dress, the one you cut off me. I patched it into the hem of the coat I'm wearing. If I die, you take it. You sell the valley. You take the money and you disappear." Caleb finally shifted his gaze to her. Her face was pale, framed by the rough canvas hood of the coat, but she looked beautiful in a raw, defiant way. "I'm not leaving this mountain with a piece of paper, Abigail," he said. "I'm leaving it with my wife." The word didn't sound like a lie anymore. It hung between them, heavy and absolute. Before she could answer, a pebble clattered down the rock face opposite them. Caleb immediately looked back through the sights. Rust, tied securely to a stunted pine behind them, let out a deep, muffled growl. "They're here," Caleb breathed. Shadows moved at the mouth of the cut. Not 2 men. Not 3. 7 riders in heavy winter gear, their horses picking their way carefully over the ice. In the lead was Sheriff Miller. Riding directly beside him was a man Caleb didn't recognize, a tall man in a bowler hat and a long duster, riding a massive black stallion. The man held himself with the arrogant ease of someone who paid others to take bullets for him. "Wyatt," Abigail hissed. Her whole body went rigid beside Caleb. "He came himself," Caleb said, a grim satisfaction settling into his chest. "Arrogant bastard couldn't wait. He wants to see me dragged back. He's going to see a lot of things," Caleb said. He pulled back the hammer on the Sharps. The click was swallowed by the howling wind through the cut. Caleb didn't aim for Wyatt. He aimed for the rock wall 20 feet directly above Wyatt's head. He had spent years studying this pass. He knew exactly what held the snowpack together and what would tear it apart. He exhaled slowly, letting the air empty from his lungs. He squeezed the trigger. The boom of the buffalo rifle in the narrow canyon was deafening. The .50 caliber slug slammed into a fault line in the granite. For a second, nothing happened. The riders jerked their horses to a halt, looking around wildly. Then the mountain answered. With a sound like tearing canvas, a massive sheet of ice and snow detached from the upper cliff. It didn't fall. It cascaded, gathering thousands of pounds of rock and frozen mud as it swept down the sheer wall. "Avalanche!" Miller screamed, spurring his horse violently backward. Wyatt's black stallion reared, panicked by the thunderous roar. The back half of the riding party didn't have time to turn. The slide hit the canyon floor with a concussive impact that shook the ledge Caleb and Abigail were lying on. A cloud of white powder exploded upward, blinding the entire canyon. 3 riders were instantly buried under 10 feet of rock and ice. Caleb didn't wait for the dust to settle. He dropped the Sharps, drew his Colt, and scrambled down the goat trail, sliding on his boots, using the chaos as his cover. "Stay here," he yelled back at Abigail. He hit the canyon floor, running. The air was thick with freezing snow dust. He heard horses screaming and men cursing. A shape emerged from the whiteout. One of Wyatt's hired guns, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, leveling a repeater rifle blindly. Caleb didn't slow down. He fired on the move. The Colt bucked in his hand, and the man folded at the waist, dropping into the snow. Caleb roared into the white dust. Wyatt! A bullet zipped past Caleb's ear, shattering against the rock wall behind him. He dove behind the carcass of a dead horse. Spread out! Find him! That was Wyatt's voice. Cultured, furious barking orders from somewhere behind the wall of ice the avalanche had created. Sheriff Miller appeared through the haze, his revolver drawn, looking panicked. He saw Caleb behind the horse. Miller raised his gun. Nothing personal, mountain man. Before Caleb could return fire, a deafening blast tore through the canyon from above. A heavy spray of buckshot shredded the snow around Miller. The sheriff screamed, dropping his revolver, clutching his right leg as he collapsed into the mud. Caleb looked up. Abigail hadn't stayed on the ledge. She had climbed halfway down, bracing the shotgun against a rock, outcropping her face, a mask of absolute fury. Caleb broke from cover. He sprinted the remaining 20 yards, kicking Miller's gun away. As he passed him, heading straight toward the voice of Cole Wyatt. The snow dust was clearing. Wyatt was backed against the canyon wall, his horse gone. He was holding a silver-plated revolver, his immaculate duster covered in dirt. 2 of his surviving men were trying to dig their horses out of the rubble. They saw Caleb and raised their rifles. "Drop 'em," Caleb said, not slowing down. The Colt leveled steadily at Wyatt's chest. "Or he dies before you touch the triggers." The hired guns hesitated. They looked at Wyatt. Wyatt sneered, recovering his composure. "You're a fool, Caleb. You shoot me, my men put 50 holes in you. You think a dirty piece of land is worth dying for." "I don't care about the land," Caleb said. He closed the distance until he was 10 feet from the cattle baron. "Tell them to drop the rifles, Wyatt." Wyatt laughed, a dry, ugly sound. "And what you take me in, to who I own the judges in Denver. I own the marshals in Red Dog. You can't touch me legally, and you know it. I don't plan on taking you to a judge," Caleb said quietly. He didn't look back, but he heard the crunch of boots on the ice. Abigail stepped up beside him. She dropped the empty shotgun and pulled a small silver derringer from her coat pocket, a gun Caleb had never seen before. She leveled it directly at Wyatt's face. Wyatt looked at her. For the first time, the arrogant smirk faltered. He saw the cold, dead certainty in her grey eyes. He remembered the cellar. He remembered what he had done to her, and he suddenly realized that the law didn't matter in Dead Man's Cut. "Abigail," Wyatt said, his voice dropping an octave. "Be reasonable. We can make a deal." "You lost the right to make deals when you locked me in the dark," she said. Her voice didn't shake. "She's my wife," Caleb said, his voice carrying clearly over the wind. "Territorial law says a man has the right to kill any man who threatens his family. And you threatened my family, Wyatt." Wyatt's eyes darted from Caleb's Colt to Abigail's derringer. He was a businessman who played with violence, but he was staring at 2 people who lived in it. "Drop the guns," Wyatt snapped to his men. The hired hands eagerly threw their rifles into the snow. They weren't paid enough to die in an avalanche zone. "Now what?" Wyatt asked, trying to maintain his dignity. "You murder an unarmed man." Caleb holstered his Colt. Wyatt relaxed slightly, thinking he had won the moral high ground. He didn't see Caleb's right fist coming until it shattered his nose. Wyatt hit the ice-hard blood spraying across his face. He groaned, clutching his ruined face. Caleb stood over him, breathing heavily. "You're going to get on one of those surviving horses. You're going to take your wounded sheriff and your men, and you're going to ride out of this valley. If I ever see your face on my mountain again, I won't punch you. I'll bury you." Wyatt didn't argue. He spat a mouthful of blood onto the ice, hauled himself to his feet, and stumbled toward the horses. Caleb watched them mount up. He didn't turn away until they had navigated the rubble and disappeared down the pass, riding hard for the safety of the lowlands. The wind died down. The mountain was quiet again. Caleb turned to Abigail. She was staring down the pass, the small derringer, still gripped tightly in her hand. Slowly she lowered it. The adrenaline drained out of her, leaving her suddenly exhausted. Her knees buckled slightly. Caleb caught her. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tightly against his chest. She didn't fight it. She buried her face into his heavy coat, her arms wrapping around his waist, holding on as if he were the only solid thing left in the world. He buried his face in her hair. It smelled of wood smoke and gunpowder. It was the best thing he had ever smelled. "It's over," Caleb whispered into her ear. She pulled back just enough to look up at him. The mountain man whose eyes had been so dead when she first collapsed on his porch was looking at her with a fierce, possessive warmth. "You didn't ask if I really had the deed," she whispered, a ghost of a smile touching her bruised lips. "I don't care about the deed," Caleb said. He reached up his rough thumb, gently brushing a streak of dirt from her cheek. "But if we're going to keep living in that cabin, we need a bigger bed." Abigail let out a laugh that sounded remarkably like a sob, leaning up to press her forehead against his chin. The spring thaw was still a month away. The mountain was still cold, unforgiving and brutal. But as Caleb held her in the ruins of the pass, listening to the steady, strong beat of her heart against his, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't pretending anymore. If you loved seeing Caleb and Abigail fight their way from a desperate lie to a fierce, undeniable love hit, that like Button right now, their survival on the mountain is proof that sometimes the coldest places forge the strongest bonds. Want more gritty, deeply emotional Western romance stories?